a good start. Welcome all to the third talk of the seminar. Today we are very lucky to have Kjetil Loftsgarden, who is a professor at the University of Oslo in archaeology. And he's going to talk about his research in Viking Age burial from the 6th and 7th century in Norway. I think it's just going to keep it very short. Kjetil, I think you are much better to introduce yourself. So take it away.
Thank you. So I'll have to share my screen first of all. Let's see.
Yes, perfect.
Yeah. Do you see the presentation now?
Yes, it's
great. Okay. I would just like to first of all thank you for the opportunity to get to talk about my research. It's really nice to have the opportunity to do this online, although of course it would be really nice to get to go to Iceland, but that will have to be for the next time. I'm an associate professor here at the Museum of Cultural History. So I work with lots of different things, but mainly from the late Iron Age and the Middle Ages. But in the last couple of years, I have worked within a multidisciplinary project, which is called Volcanic Eruptions and Their Impacts on Climate. Impacts on climate, environment, and Viking society in 500 to 1250 CE. So quite a broad time frame, and we have included or stretched the Viking Age quite a bit because it's easier to get funding that way, most of all, and more specifically, me and my colleague Frode Iversen has worked with establishing an overview of the population of Scandinavia from around 400 to 1000 AD. And we have tried to do so by using burials as a population proxy. So in addition to radiocarbon dates, which I will talk about today. So unfortunately and really sadly, my colleague Frode Iversen, he passed away for 1.5 years ago. But the data I present here is in collaboration with Frode, and he was really an integral part of this project. Let's go back to the early 6th century AD. So this is quite a calm, stable period, at least regarding the climate. It seems to have been a period with an increase in the population over time, but it is, of course, a hierarchical society. There is no or very few prospects of social mobility and so on. But we have really rich grave goods in this period. It's called the Golden Period, or called the Golden Period in Norway because of all the gold finds. But the men, the women, and children who lived in Norway, they experienced something they had never done before, never seen before, suddenly, because in the summer or the spring of 536, the sun became dim, and a veil covered the sky, preventing the vital warmth of the sun from reaching the fields. And this dust veil, it lasted all summer and resulted in crop failures and and really likely a panic in society. And this experience may have caused or formed the basis for the Fimbulwinter, the myth of the Fimbulwinter, which we know from Norse mythology and much later. And this is described as a great winter. It's the immediate prelude to the events of the Ragnarok, the end of times. And the Fimbulwinter is described to have lasted 3 long years with no summer in between. It really resembles what they could have experienced in the mid-6th century. But what we know now and what they of course did not know is that this dust veil was caused by a massive volcanic eruption in 536. And then another really large eruption in 540, just 4 years later. And these two volcanic eruptions seems to have instigated or caused a decline in the temperature and had global impacts on the climate. Of course, immediately as the dust veil blocked out the sun, but also it was a consequence that it was a lasting longer, colder climate, lasting for as much as 100 or 150 years after these eruptions. So this data is based on ice cores from Greenland and also tree-ring data. So this is the backdrop for our project, the Vikings project, which I call it. This is it was originally from 2018 to 2023, but we have gotten an extension, so it also is this year, but it will be this is the last year of the project. So as I said, this is a multidisciplinary project where we try to combine the hard science aspects, so climate modeling and so on, with and volcanic eruptions, geology, meteorology, with archaeology and the cultural history. So we want to try to understand the role of volcanic eruptions and the subsequent climate change and how that what the role was in shaping the early history of Europe. And in addition to the volcanic eruptions, you also have the first global pandemic, which hits Europe in 541. This seems to have been started in Egypt and the Byzantine or Turkey region and spreading all over Europe. And the bacteria have been found in Germany and north of the Alps and also in England. So far, we have not found this bacteria in Scandinavia, but it's likely that it also hit Scandinavia. And it's really few. We have few skeletal remains from that time period, so we'll be lucky if we found it anyway. So in the mid-6th century, you have two massive volcanic eruptions, and the subsequent climate change, and you also have the first plague pandemic. So this was really a turbulent time, a crisis indeed. And early in archaeology, prior to any knowledge of the past volcanic eruptions or worsening climate for that sense, the 6th century was defined as a transitional period, as a boundary between the early Iron Age and the late Iron Age. And this was due to the widespread changes which we see in the material culture in this time period. We see changes in language. There's a change in the runic inscriptions. There's a change in technology, for instance, in iron production technology, which changes around this time period. Also, there's a reorganization of the settlement structures. There's a change in ornaments. Pottery goes out of use in Scandinavia at least, and of course many more changes. And this could be because of the mid-6th century crisis, but and it has been argued or suggested that half the population in Scandinavia perished following this crisis. But the problem is that we don't really have that much data to support this. But this was the starting point for the project which me and Frode started on. So we wanted to estimate changes in the population going back to the Iron Age. But when we want to estimate changes in the population, there are not that much historical sources which we can rely on in Scandinavia. So the first census is quite late. It's not until the late 18th century. This map shows the population pattern or the spatial like the population density in Scandinavia based on this first census in the late 18th century. But it's likely that this reflects how it might have looked also in the Iron Age. So with quite sparsely populated or areas in Norway or the northern part of Scandinavia with more densely populated areas in South Scandinavia. So we have a few written sources in the 12th century, or after the 12th century, but quite limited, not something that we can rely on as a proxy or try to get and establish the population, at least. This means that we have to rely on archaeological sources. So we can use settlement sites, burials, radiocarbon data from excavations and surveys, and all these aspects have source critical challenges, which I will try to address. Well, in our project, we have used burial data and radiocarbon data. So our research project, no, main research question is, was there a decline in the population following the 6th century crisis? And we have, as I mentioned, tried to shed light on this using 2 strands. So we want to use dated burials, and we want to use radiocarbon dates from archaeological sites. But the underlying assumption is the same. So the more the burials, the larger the population, and the more radiocarbon dates, the more human activity, and the larger the population. So let's start with the burials. So in Scandinavia, in the Iron Age, burials are usually either flat graves or in burial mounds or cairns, or they are the ones that we can find, at least. And most burials contain artifacts, such as weapons, jewelry, and tools. And again, this is because if there is a burial which haven't got any artifacts, and if you don't get any preserved bones, it's difficult to distinguish that as a burial. So you know this. So we know in Scandinavia more like thousands of burials. I think it's about, I'm not sure how many, but really quite a lot. But the vast majority of the burial finds are not from excavations, but they are from farmers working in the fields, especially in the 1800s, but also increasingly now for the last 20 years from metal detecting. So since most burials are not excavated, we can't rely on radiocarbon dates on most of the burials. So in our data set, we have used typologically dating for the most part. So as you all know, this means that if we have one artifact type, for instance, a certain type of spearhead, which is dated from 800 to 900, a burial with this type of spearhead is also dated to 800 to 900. So it could be quite a broad dating. You also have more precise dating using topology, of course. So we have in our data set 7,500 burials from the early Iron Age to the late Iron Age. In Norway, that means from 500 BC to 1000 AD, more or less. And all these 7,500 are dated within an archaeological period, which in Norway is about 200 years each. So for instance, the Viking Age. So in our data set, we also have more precisely dated burials. But if we want the more precise dated burials we want to use, the smaller the data set will become. So we have chosen to use archaeological periods as our category. Then you will get the largest data set, the more robust data set. But of course, it's not really that precise, but it is precise enough for our to answer our research questions, we believe. So this is the distribution of the chronological distribution of the burials. So most of the burials have been typologically dated based on one or more artifacts. So if you have more artifacts, you can get a more precise dating. And this offers an approximate date, but depending on the artifacts, this date may fall between two archaeological periods. So, for instance, late Roman age or migration period in this transitional period. Or it could be also just dated to larger overarching time spans, such as the late Iron Age. And to mitigate this, we have distributed these burials according to their relative chronological distribution of burials with a more precise dates. So, for instance, here the first step will be to distribute the 62 burials from the Roman age. Roman age is 1 to 400 AD, and we want to distribute these 62 burials within early Roman age and late Roman age, based on the percentage or the existing percentage distribution between these two time periods. So, and these numbers are then carried to the next calculation and so on. And this is done with each transitional category. So here you see in this diagram, you see the number of dated burials where we have distributed the transitional dated artifacts as well. So here you see the number of dated burials within each archaeological period, which is each is being around 200 years, more or less. And what really stands out here, as you see, is the decline following the 6th century. The number of dated burials in the 7th and 8th centuries is remarkably low. But we have to, if we go a bit deeper in the data, we see there are quite significant differences between the western coast and the eastern coast of Norway. So our data material is from the Gulating region in the west and the Borgarting region in the southeast. So this is the medieval law areas. But what we see here is that not only is the number of dated burials prior to the Viking Age quite low in the east compared to the west, but the decrease following the migration period, also following the 6th century, is quite low or barely visible in the Borgarting region. But we think that the explanation for this is that Borgarting, so the southeast part, have a larger percentage of burials dated to merely the early Iron Age. So early Iron Age is 500 BC to 550 AD. A quarter of the burials from this time period in the southeast, in Borgarting, is only dated to the early Iron Age. So it is likely that this difference is linked to the relative prevalence of pottery in Gulating in the west, especially the often richly decorated bucket-shaped pottery. So in the east, the Borgarting regions, burials rarely contain pottery, or at least more rarely, and that makes them more difficult to date precisely, and a larger proportion of the burials are consequently dated to the early Iron Age as a whole, like 25%, as I said. So to account for this, we have used the same percentage method to distribute the dated burials to the larger time spans of the Iron Age, and then the early Iron Age, and then finally the late Iron Age. And we do this for both Gulating and for Borgarting. And the result is that the Borgarting and the Gulating really are quite similar pattern, with an increase from the late Roman Age to the migration period, and then a marked decrease following the migration period and until the Merovingian period, and then an increase again in the Viking Age. So if we combine this data again, this is all the coastal areas in South Norway. We see the pattern is quite clear, that you see the same pattern, and of course what really stands out is the low number of burials from the Merovingian period. So Merovingian is the Norwegian term. Like I'm not sure what do we call it in Iceland, but this is the 7th and 8th centuries, and there are really quite few compared to the previous and the later periods. And this is contrary to what you should assume that based on taphonomic effects. So you would assume that there are more, like based on the preservation, the nearer you get to our time, the more preserved you have. So longer back in time, less burials will be preserved, of course. In addition, the migration period is only about 150 years, while the Merovingian period is almost 250 years. So this really is just adds to how strange it is that there are so few burials dated to the Merovingian period. Yeah, we can move on to radiocarbon dates. So we have used radiocarbon dates or tried to apply radiocarbon dates as a method as well, just to substantiate our results from the burials. And of course, radiocarbon dates have increasingly been used as an archaeological proxy for paleodemographic studies. So there are several source critical aspects, so such as the size of the data and the size of the data set, sampling bias, effect of the calibration curve, and so on. So, but the basic premise is the relationship between the quantities of radiocarbon dates and the intensity of past population activities. So if you accept this premise, there are several advantages. So dates, or radiocarbon dates, is easily available, and continually they are increasing in numbers with new excavations, surveys, and so on. And by using proper methods and having a source critical method, they are comparable across time and space. The use of radiocarbon dates as data have mostly been used on the earliest time periods, so the Bronze Age, the Neolithic, and so on. But also it have been used on the Iron Age. Here is a study which my colleagues Steinar Solheim and Frode Iversen have done using Vestfold County as a case study. So Vestfold County is part of the Borgarting region, but here you also see the decrease following the 6th century, which is really marked in this diagram. And with Steinar, we have also expanded on this data set. We have included data, radiocarbon dates from most of Eastern Norway. And this is about 7,000 or more than 7,000 dates from excavated archaeological sites. And we have also divided the data into 4 categories from the type of data structure. We have done this to visualize problems concerning representativity. So what you see here you see on the top, you see the combined C14 diagram, and you see this decrease following the 6th century. Yeah, I should have marked it. Yeah. But if we divide it, we can see also the decrease in houses, but this is due to settlement reorganization, which I talked about briefly. And also cooking pit goes out of use in the 6th century. So there are changes happening which affects the radiocarbon dates. But also if you see other, which is every radiocarbon date, which are not included in the house, iron production, or cooking pits, you see this decrease following the 6th century. So if you look only at Borgarting, the inland areas, there are quite a lot of dates from outfield resources such as hunting and trapping, iron production, tar production, and so on, which often skew the picture a bit. So if you look at just the coastal areas, we have a visualization here, and you'd see quite clearly this decline following the 536 event, or the mid-6th century. So it's really quite clear. But there are regional differences. So I have now looked at the coastal areas of Norway and only Norway, but we have also a project or a written study which we have included or with colleagues from Sweden, we have included the data from a region in the inlands of Sweden, as well as the coastal areas of Sweden. And this data set shows the opposite. We don't see the decline following the 6th century. We see an increase following the 6th century. So there are quite clearly regional differences in how this mid-6th century affected the society. So we have to look more into that, but it's quite clear that there are regional differences, so we can't say that one size fits all regarding the consequences of the mid-6th century crisis. But regarding South Norway, it's quite clear that you see the sudden decrease in burials following the 6th century and also the drop in the numbers of radiocarbon dates. This all combined seems to point to a real decline in the population following the 6th century. So with that established, we can look more into the consequences, or at least what could have been the consequences of the 6th century crisis. So it's no doubt that this was a catastrophic event for those who lived through the mid-6th century. No question about it. But could also the 6th century crisis have been a violent shock, which may have led to new opportunities for those who survived, and perhaps also opened up new doors that previously had been closed? You can look perhaps to the aftermath of the Black Death to find similarities. And to answer this, we should look into happiness. Happiness for as many as possible. And this does not equate to rich archaeological finds, perhaps the other way around. But everyone assesses how much they enjoy the life they live. And although there are differences in how happy people are, the basis of happiness appears to be quite similar across cultures. So people form the notion of happiness from the desires of what they want in life, and then they compare these goals with the realities of life. So what you want opposed to what you get. So in modern societies, people are happier the more in control they have of their own lives. And of course, they are more happy at the top of the social ladder than closer to the bottom. But a factor that seems to be of great importance for happiness, as well as to be more positive for the society as a whole, is equality. Statistics from modern societies, as well as studies from pre-modern societies, indicates that human beings are found to be more happy and also more healthy the more economically equal we are. Unfortunately, it seems that at least after the introduction of agriculture, the norm is various degrees of inequality. So today, the people of Scandinavia is ranked among the most happiest in the world, but this was likely far from the realities of Iron Age Scandinavia, which was really a strictly hierarchical society, and you had limited prospects of social mobility, at least for the majority of the population. The historian Walter Scheidel, he argues that inequality would only decrease in any significant extent by violent shock, which shocks that disrupted the established order and narrowed the gap between the rich and the poor. So he maintains that there are 4 violent ruptures that could even out inequality. So mass mobilization warfare, transformative revolution, state failures, and lethal pandemics. So it's only the last which is relevant here, and we can add lethal pandemics and changes due to climate change or worsening climate. So he likened these to the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. But afterwards, after this violent shock, the survivors, for the survivors of this shock, the gap between the have and the have-nots sank drastically. So the question is, could the crisis of the mid-6th century have acted as a great leveler, resulting in the 7th century as a period in which most people were consistently more happy than the periods before and after? We know that population growth is often associated with more inequality, and population decline are associated with a reduction in inequality. And there seems to be more economic equality in the 14th and the 15th century following the huge demographic losses caused by the Black Death. Most studies, larger studies, indicate that the period from 1300 to 1800, you see an increase in inequality of both income and wealth in general, almost everywhere in Europe, with the exception being the century-long phase of decline of inequality, which is triggered by the Black Death or the population decline of the Black Death. And this is shown in a unique study of economic inequality in the Florentine state, which they have really good tax records, and they have used those to show the level of inequality using a Gini index. So a Gini index is between 1 and 0, which 0 represents the perfect equal distribution of resources, while 1 is the opposite. So 0, then everybody has exactly the same, and one person who have everything and the other have nothing. But their data provide strong support for the idea that the Black Death had an egalitarian impact on the distribution of wealth. It was the leveling of the society. So massive social and economic crisis would perhaps lead to a population decline, that which our data also perhaps indicates at least, and this could have led to a leveling of the society. So where the survivors from the poorest part of the society after a crisis will end up with a relatively larger share of the wealth. There will be more land for distribution, and of course the labor forces will be valued higher. But of course this was not a utopian socialist society. So although the population in general may have been more equal, it is also possible that a select few are able to increase their wealth. So the lower strata of the elite tend to get poorer and poorer from attempting to maintain their former elite status, but on a failing economic basis. So this forces them into debts or into selling their land, while a few in the upper classes, like the Musk of their time, on the other hand, they are able to maintain their elite status and still have assets to acquire land from their increasingly poorer neighbors. So poorer elite neighbors. So most of the elites will struggle to maintain their standing, but a select few will come out on top at the expense of their former contemporaries. So perhaps the Rakne mound is a testament to this. This is the largest mound or burial mound in Scandinavia, at least, perhaps also in northern Europe. And this was likely constructed in 551 or 552 AD, so around 15 years later than 536. So for the people who experienced the years without summer, who lived through the many successive lean years, who saw the loved ones die of hunger or the plague, there is no doubt that the 6th century was a crisis that could have left a mark for generations. But perhaps for those who survived, for those who came out of the crisis, the life situation was quite different from before the crisis. So the population decline is likely to have had a leveling effect on the society and triggered a phase of reduction in inequality, where the distribution of land and wealth was more equal, and where the majority of the population, at least in the 7th century, may have experienced a greater happiness than the previous generations. But sadly, if there ever was a wonderful 7th century, it is quite likely that this was short-lived. At least if you look at data from the Florentine state, this indicates that less than a century after the Black Death, wealth inequality was as high as before the plague. So to shortly sum up, we have used burial data as well as radiocarbon data, and we have used those as proxies to try to show the ebb and flow of the population. And we argue that based on this data that there was a substantial population decline following the mid-6th century. That is in Norway, because as we have seen, there are regional differences. So it's not, could see a different picture if you look at another regions. But the population decline could have been on a similar level to the Black Death in regards to number. It's hard to tell for sure. But also similar to the Black Death, the population decline may have had a leveling effect for the society. Well, that is at least for a while. Yeah, thank you.
Very well.